old truck rumbled down the logging road, long abandoned and overgrown, until even it could go no further. We bailed out, packs heavy, the silence of the place swallowing the engine's final cough. Ben, our guide, spat dust and adjusted his wide-brimmed hat, scanning the dense, ancient trees that loomed ahead. No fence, no official signage, just painted warnings on the last standing pines bordering the forgotten road. Crude, weathered symbols and faded, hand-stenciled words. Restricted area, extreme hazard, weathered symbols and faded, hand-stenciled. The locals called it the Blackwood. The stories whispered about it were variations on a single, chilling theme. You go in, you might not come out. As a journalist specializing in environmental mysteries and forgotten places, the Blackwood had become an obsession. Disappearances dotted its periphery over decades. Hunters, hikers, even a small plane once. Its wreckage never found. Officially, its periphery over decades. Sinkholes, old mining shafts, maybe a territorial black bear. The unofficial explanations ranged from cryptids, hunters, hikers, even a small plane to find out which was true. Its wreckage never found. If the truth lay somewhere stranger. Officially, to its periphery over decades. Sinkholes, old mining shafts came from years, maybe a territorial black bear. Unforgiving landscape. The unofficial explanations ranged from cryptids, kind of knowledge only hunters, hikers, and Dr. Evelyn Reed, an ecologist whose skepticism was as sharp as her scientific mind. She was fascinated by the alleged biological anomalies, strange plant mutations, unusual animal behavior reported by those few who skirted the edges and came back shaken. Our equipment was top tier, satellite phones, though reception was rumored to be spotty deep inside, multiple GPS units, old school compasses, Ben swore by them, detailed topographic maps dating back half a century, environmental sensors, recording gear, and enough supplies for 2 weeks. We were prepared for rugged wilderness, for getting lost, for potential hazards. What we weren't sure we were prepared for was the feeling of the place. Even from the edge, it pressed in. The light seemed different, filtered through the impossibly thick canopy in a way that felt less like sunlight and more like liquid green-gray shadow. The air, though crisp and clean, carried a faint, earthy odor that wasn't quite right. Deeper, heavier than damp soil and decaying leaves. And the silence. That was the first truly unsettling thing. In a forest of this age and density, there should be a constant symphony of life. Birdsong, insect hum, the rustle of small animals. Here there was almost nothing. A profound stillness that felt less like absence and more like anticipation. As we finalized our gear check, the air itself seemed to thicken, growing heavy and still. The painted warnings on the trees seemed to pulse with a quiet malevolence in the shifting light. Ben caught my eye, his usual easy grin absent. "All right, Alex," he said, his voice low. "Once we step across, there's no casual stroll back. You sure about this?" Evelyn adjusted her glasses, her expression a mix of scientific curiosity and a hint of apprehension she couldn't quite mask. "The data possibilities alone are significant. If the anecdotal evidence holds even a fraction of truth," she said, her voice steadier than Ben's. "But I admit, the atmosphere, it's palpable." My own heart was thumping, a mix of journalistic excitement and primal unease. This was it, the boundary, stepping from the known, albeit forgotten, world into the heart of the Blackwood. We took a collective breath, checked our compasses one last time and stepped over the invisible line. The transition wasn't marked by anything physical, but the feeling was instantaneous. It was like walking into a different pressure zone, Or perhaps a soundproof room that also muted the world outside. The air immediately felt cooler, the strange earthy smell intensified, and the silence deepened, becoming absolute. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It felt like sound was being actively absorbed. My hand instinctively went to the small digital recorder in my pocket, pressing record. Entry log, day 1, I murmured, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet. Entering the Blackwood forest boundary at approximately 10:30 a.m. Estat. Initial impressions: profound silence, unusual atmospheric density, and a distinctive odor. I trailed off, trying to find the right words. It smelled ancient, yes, but also wrong, like deep time and something else, something inorganic. Ben led the way, his pace cautious. Evelyn followed, already peering at the undergrowth, a hand lens in her hand. I brought up the rear, my senses on high alert, trying to process the flood of subtle, disquieting inputs. The trees here were different, older, yes, but their bark had an almost metallic sheen in places, and some of the lower branches twisted into unnatural, grotesque shapes. The ground was a thick carpet of leaves, but beneath them, the soil felt strangely compacted in some areas, spongy in others. There were no discernible animal trails, nothing to suggest large wildlife moved through here regularly, which was itself deeply unnatural for a forest of this size. After an hour of walking, the initial novelty wore off, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Ben consulted his compass, then the GPS, then the map. He did this more often than I'd seen him do on previous trips, even in challenging terrain. "Everything looks right," he muttered, more to himself than us. "But it feels off." He paused, squinting at the dense tangle ahead. The light. It's harder to judge distance in here. Everything looks closer, then further away, depending on how you look at it. Evelyn chimed in. "The lux levels are fluctuating erratically, even under uniform canopy cover. There's no atmospheric phenomenon I'm aware of that would cause this kind of localized light distortion." She held up a small meter, its reading jumping erratically. "And my atmospheric composition sensor is showing minor fluctuations in gases I wouldn't expect to find at these concentrations in a healthy forest environment. Trace levels of something akin to sulfur compounds, but not quite. And methane spikes, but no obvious organic source like a swamp nearby." The scientific data only amplified the subjective feeling of wrongness. It wasn't just our perception. The instruments were picking up anomalies too. We pushed on, deeper into the Blackwood. The air grew colder, despite the physical exertion of the hike. We passed a patch of fungi that glowed faintly with a sickly green light, unlike any bioluminescence Evelyn had ever seen. She collected a sample carefully, placing it in a sterile container. The trees seemed to press closer, their branches interlocking above us, forming a ceiling that allowed only fragmented shards of light to penetrate, creating disorienting patterns on the forest floor. The silence remained, broken only by our footsteps and breathing. It felt suffocating. My recorder was still running, picking up the crunch of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, our hushed voices. Listening back later, I imagined, it would sound like an audio track from a horror movie, the silence punctuated by the sounds of intruders in a forbidden place. Ben stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. We froze. He tilted his head, listening intently. I strained my ears, hearing only the blood pounding in them. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. We shook our heads. Sounded like rockfall? Far off, but wrong. He looked worried. Rockfalls happen, especially in mountainous regions. But his reaction suggested this sound was different, unnatural. We waited for several minutes, hearing nothing more. The silence had returned, heavier than before. We continued, the incident adding another layer to the growing sense of dread. Every shadow seemed deeper. Every twisted branch looked like a grasping hand. Every rustle of leaves, when they finally did rustle, a dry, unnatural sound, made us jump. The feeling of being watched was constant now, a prickling sensation on the back of the neck. It wasn't just paranoia. It felt like a tangible presence, unseen eyes tracking our movements through the dense undergrowth. We reached a small clearing as dusk began to settle, earlier here than it should have been due to the canopy. It was a circular space, unnervingly devoid of trees, the ground covered in a grey, fine soil unlike the rich earth we'd been traversing. In the center was a cluster of stones arranged in a rough circle. They looked ancient, weathered not just by time, but by something else. Something that seemed to have smoothed their surfaces in impossible ways. Evelyn knelt by one of the stones, running a gloved hand over its surface. "Basalt," she murmured, "but highly eroded, almost polished, and warm. It's giving off residual heat." This was strange. There was no geological activity known in this area that would explain warm rocks. Ben surveyed the clearing, his eyes narrowed. "Not a place I'd want to camp," he said flatly. "Feels wrong." I agreed. The place emanated an aura of profound age and something deeply unsettling. It felt like a place that had been used a long time ago for purposes we couldn't comprehend, and that still held the echo of those activities. It was decided. We'd push on a little longer, find a place outside the clearing, despite the fading light. The decision felt less like a choice, and more like an instinctual imperative. As we left the clearing, stepping back into the oppressive silence of the woods, I glanced back. In the deepening gloom, the stones seemed to pulse faintly, or perhaps it was just my eyes playing tricks in the strange light. But the feeling of leaving a place of immense ancient power lingered, chilling me to the bone. We found a spot for camp about half a mile further on, nestled between two massive ancient oaks. It was still silent, still dark, but it felt marginally less hostile than the clearing. Setting up the tents was a quiet, efficient process. The sounds of our movements seemed absorbed by the environment. We kept the campfire small, its light barely pushing back the intense darkness that gathered under the canopy. The air around the fire seemed cooler than it should have been. We ate a simple meal from our packs. The conversation hushed. The events of the day weighed on us. The unnerving silence, the fluctuating light, the strange air, the warm stones, Ben's mysterious sound. Evelyn tried to find logical explanations for the anomalies, citing potential microclimates, unique geological formations affecting magnetic fields, which could explain compass issues and GPS glitches, or even unusual microbial activity causing the faint glow and smell. Ben, more pragmatic, focused on survival basics, double-checking our perimeter, ensuring our supplies were secure. I sat by the fire, recorder still running intermittently, trying to synthesize the sensory overload and the unsettling data. The forest around us felt like a living entity, not in a benign, natural way, but in a way that felt aware and indifferent, perhaps even malevolent. As darkness fully descended, the sounds began again. Not loud, not distinct at first, but a chorus of faint, unidentifiable noises that seemed to weave in and out of the silence. Rustling that wasn't wind or animal, soft clicks and taps that had no source, a low hum that vibrated more in the chest than the ears. Ben was on edge, constantly scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Evelyn sat with her environmental sensors, frowning at the readings that spiked and dipped in time with the strange sounds. My recorder captured it all, the sounds themselves frustratingly elusive, seemingly always just beyond the range of clear identification, or perhaps just beyond the threshold of normal hearing. The feeling of being watched intensified. It felt like there were countless eyes in the darkness, just beyond the reach of our small campfire's light, observing us with an ancient, patient gaze. Sleep felt impossible. Every snap of a twig, every creak of a tree branch, every whisper of the inexplicable sounds sent jolts of adrenaline through me. This wasn't just a dangerous wilderness. It was a place that felt fundamentally wrong, a place that actively resisted our presence. Lying in my tent, wrapped in my sleeping bag, the sounds seemed to press closer, swirling around our small camp. I pulled the recorder closer, ensuring it was still on, wanting to capture every disquieting detail. The silence of the Blackwood was terrifying, but the sounds that broke it were worse. They were sounds that didn't belong to the natural world, sounds that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the forest itself. The first night in the Blackwood was less about rest and more about enduring. Enduring the silence, enduring the strange sounds, enduring the crushing weight of the feeling that we were not only unwelcome, but were actively being observed by something ancient and unknown. The second day dawned not with sunlight filtering gently through the leaves, but with a gradual lessening of the intense darkness, the light remaining a perpetual, watery green-gray. We emerged from our tents tired, our unease amplified by the restless night. Ben looked drawn, his eyes scanning the tree line constantly. Evelyn was poring over her environmental sensor data, her brow furrowed. The atmospheric composition fluctuations correlate with the sound events, she reported, her voice tired. And the magnetic field is fluctuating wildly. It's not just affecting the compass. It seems to be interfering with some of the other electronics too. The GPS signals are inconsistent, and my atmospheric sensor readings are spiking in correlation with geomagnetic shifts. This isn't typical electromagnetic interference. It feels organic somehow, or perhaps generated by a unique, active geological feature, but one unlike anything I've studied. We packed up camp quickly, the silence feeling even more oppressive in the morning light that wasn't quite light. The strange, earthy smell was stronger now, almost cloying. Ben consulted his compass and GPS, then the map, shaking his head. "We should be heading northwest based on yesterday's movement," he said, pointing. "But the land, it feels wrong. The topography doesn't match the map here." He showed us. The elevation changes didn't align. A small creek marked on the map was nowhere to be seen, and a distinctive rock formation he'd noted the previous day seemed to have vanished or shifted relative to our position. It was more than just getting turned around. It felt like the very layout of the forest was subtly changing, or that we were moving through a space that didn't conform to linear geography. We decided to trust the compass, despite its earlier wobbles, and Ben's instinct. We picked a direction that felt right, based on his years of wilderness navigation, and pushed through the dense undergrowth. The going was tough. The trees grew closer together here, their lower branches gnarled and difficult to pass. The ground was uneven, hidden roots and sinkholes masked by the thick leaf litter. We moved slower than planned, every step requiring concentration. The feeling of being watched was relentless, a constant pressure on our senses. We stopped for a brief rest near a cluster of trees with unnaturally pale bark, almost bone white. As we paused, the silence broke. Not with the strange sounds of the night, but with a single clear sound. A high-pitched metallic hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It vibrated in our teeth and bones, intensely uncomfortable. Evelyn covered her ears, wincing. "That's infrasound," she gasped, her voice tight with pain. "Extremely low frequency, high intensity. It can cause disorientation, nausea, even panic." Ben was already scanning the tree line, his hand on the machete at his belt. The hum lasted for maybe 30 seconds, then cut off abruptly, leaving the silence ringing in our ears. We looked at each other, shaken. This wasn't just a weird forest. It was a forest that seemed to actively assault our senses. What could cause that? I asked, my voice hoarse. Evelyn shook her head, rubbing her temples. A large animal vocalization in a specific resonant space? Geological stress releasing energy? But that intensity, it would require immense power. Ben just stared into the trees, his usual calm replaced by a visible tension. "Whatever it is," he said slowly, "it knows we're here." We didn't linger. The infrasound experience had rattled us deeply. We pushed on, the forest seeming to thicken around us, the trees growing even denser, the light dimmer. The paths we tried to follow seemed to vanish, the undergrowth closing in behind us. We were hacking our way through, making slow, arduous progress. Evelyn continued collecting samples, strange mosses that seemed to absorb light, soil that had unusual mineral compositions, fragments of bark that showed no signs of insect activity despite their age. Her scientific curiosity was a thin veil over her growing fear. At one point we crossed a small, stagnant stream. The water was cloudy with an oily sheen and gave off a faint, chemical smell. Our purification filters refused to work, clogging immediately. We were relying on the water we carried, which was now a major concern. Ben tested the water with a portable chemical kit. "High levels of heavy metals," he reported grimly. "And something else. Can't identify it with this kit. Don't drink this." The forest was actively hostile, its natural resources contaminated or unusable. This wasn't just a hazard. It felt deliberate. The feeling of being watched was constant, occasionally punctuated by brief glimpses of movement in our peripheral vision. Shadows that detached themselves from trees, fleeting shapes that vanished when we turned our heads. Were they animals? Or just our minds playing tricks? The stress was cumulative. We hadn't slept well. Our bodies were aching from the difficult terrain, and our minds were strained by the constant sensory and psychological assault. We found another clearing in the late afternoon, smaller than the first, but similar. Circular, grey soil, strangely devoid of vegetation. In the center was not stones, but a single, gnarled tree, its bark black and twisted, its branches bare and reaching like skeletal fingers towards the perpetual twilight sky. It looked dead, but emanated a strange, low hum that felt similar to the infrasound from earlier, but much fainter, localized to the tree itself. Evelyn approached it cautiously, holding up her environmental sensors. "High energy readings," she reported, her voice hushed. "Electromagnetic field is off the charts right around the trunk. And elevated radiation? Minor, but definitely present." Radiation. That wasn't a natural forest phenomenon. It hinted at something else. Something man-made, perhaps, buried deep within the forest. Could this forest be sitting on top of something? An old, forgotten military test site? A hazardous waste dump disguised by the trees? The tree itself seemed to pulse with a quiet, contained power. It felt like the heart of the unsettling energy that permeated the Blackwood. Ben refused to go near it. "That tree ain't natural," he stated, his face grim. "It's a beacon or a drain or something. Bad energy." We didn't camp near this clearing either. Pushing on was difficult as dusk deepened into the Blackwood's version of night. The strange sounds of the previous night began again, joined now by a new, disturbing noise. A faint, rhythmic clicking, like many small stones being tapped together in the distance. It seemed to follow us. We made camp near a small rocky outcrop that offered a slight defensible position. Fatigue was setting in, blurring the edges of reality. The feeling of being watched was now a certainty. We could practically feel the weight of unseen gazes upon us. Conversation was minimal, mostly clipped instructions and observations. Evelyn was quiet, deep in thought, perhaps trying to reconcile her scientific training with the undeniable strangeness of the Blackwood. Ben was jumpy, every shadow a potential threat. I was just trying to stay present, to observe, to record, to keep the rising panic at bay. Sleep was even harder than the first night. The clicking sounds continued intermittently, sometimes closer, sometimes further away. The faint hum from the direction of the strange tree seemed to carry on the air. The forest pressed in, a heavy, breathing entity. I lay in my tent, listening, recording. The sounds on the recording seemed clearer than they did to my ears in the moment. Faint whispers beneath the clicks, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate the ground. Were these real sounds? Or was the forest somehow broadcasting directly into our minds? The psychological toll was immense. Doubt crept in. Was this wilderness or something else entirely? As the night wore on, the sounds intensified, converging on our camp. The clicking grew louder, faster. The growling deepened. A sense of dread, cold and absolute, washed over me. We were not alone. And whatever was out there did not welcome us. I fumbled for my headlamp, switching it on, its beam weak against the oppressive darkness. Ben's voice came from the next tent, tight with fear. "They're close." The third day began with a jolt, not the slow, dim awakening of the previous morning, but a sudden, jarring cessation of the night's sounds, replaced by an immediate, heavy silence that felt like a vacuum. We scrambled out of our tents, nerves frayed. Ben's face was pale, streaked with sweat and dirt. Evelyn looked exhausted, her eyes wide and bloodshot behind her glasses. The air was colder than before, carrying the intensified, strange, earthy smell now mixed with a faint metallic tang. Our camp showed no physical signs of disturbance. Nothing was moved. Nothing was broken. Yet, the feeling was undeniable. Something had been close, surrounding us just beyond the light. We packed in haste, the silence urging us to move. Ben consulted his instruments. "GPS is useless," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "Compass is spinning erratically. We have to rely on the map and instinct." This was bad. Relying solely on instinct in terrain that seemed to defy normal rules of geography was a terrifying prospect. We set off, moving as quickly as possible. Our initial direction chosen based purely on Ben's gut feeling of which way was out. The forest was even more difficult to navigate now. It seemed to thicken deliberately in our path. Areas that looked passable on the map were choked with impenetrable thorny bushes or unexpected ravines. We were forced to backtrack repeatedly, losing precious time and energy. The light distortion was worse. It was almost impossible to judge distance or scale. Trees seemed to lean at unnatural angles, their shadows twisting into disturbing shapes. The feeling of being watched was a constant, nauseating presence, no longer subtle but an almost physical weight. We passed by more anomalies, a stream where the water flowed uphill for a short stretch before cascading down a rock face that wasn't there on the map. A patch of ground where the air vibrated visibly, distorting the trees behind it like a heat haze. But the air itself was freezing cold. We collected more samples, took more readings, but they only added to the perplexing data. Geological formations that shouldn't exist, energy fields with no known source, biological material that didn't fit existing classifications. Evelyn was becoming increasingly agitated, muttering about impossible thermodynamics and unknown energy signatures. The psychological effects were escalating rapidly. We were all experiencing symptoms of extreme stress and disorientation, headaches, nausea, difficulty concentrating, vivid flashes in our peripheral vision. Paranoia was rampant. Every rustle of leaves was a potential threat. Every shadow hid something menacing. We started arguing over directions, snapping at each other. Ben, normally stoic, was visibly strained, his movements jerky. Evelyn, the rational scientist, was showing cracks, her voice trembling as she described the impossible data. I felt my own grip on reality loosening, the line between what was real and what was imagined blurring. My recordings from the previous night, when I listened back briefly, were filled with static, distorted clicks and sounds that seemed to warp and shift, losing any semblance of identification. It was like the forest was actively corrupting the recordings, refusing to be documented. Around midday, we stumbled upon something truly disturbing. A campsite, half collapsed, overgrown, but clearly not ancient. A torn nylon tent, rusted cooking gear, a backpack ripped open, its contents scattered and weathered. It looked like it had been abandoned in extreme haste, perhaps years ago. Lying near the backpack was a single hiking boot, severed at the ankle. There was no sign of the rest of the person. Ben knelt down, examining the boot and the surrounding area. His face was grim. "Bear attack?" I whispered, though something about the scene felt wrong for that. Bears usually leave more obvious signs of struggle and consumption. Ben shook his head. "Maybe. But this, it's too clean. No drag marks, no blood splatter. I can see that matches. This." He pointed to the clean, almost surgical cut of the boot and the lack of struggle marks around the scattering of gear. Evelyn, pale, stared at the scene, her scientific mind struggling to process it. "What kind of animal?" she began, but trailed off. The feeling of being watched intensified, pressing down on us. It felt like we had stumbled onto a place the forest didn't want us to see, a secret it guarded fiercely. We didn't linger. The discovery had a profound effect on us. The abstract fear of the Blackwood solidified into a terrifying certainty. People came here, and something happened to them. Something that wasn't easily explained by natural predators or accidents. We pushed on with renewed urgency, the discovery adding fuel to our desperation to escape. But the more we tried to move quickly, the more the forest seemed to impede us. Thickets became denser, slopes steeper, the disorienting light more pronounced. We were caught in a maze, and the walls seemed to be actively shifting. Our water was running low. The air grew thick and humid in some pockets, bone dry and cold in others, irrespective of terrain. The strange smells intensified, sometimes the heavy earth, Sometimes the metallic tang, sometimes a sickly sweet odor that made us nauseous. By late afternoon, physical exhaustion was critical. We had made almost no discernible progress towards the edge according to Ben's map and compass checks, which were becoming increasingly contradictory. The GPS occasionally flickered to life, showing our position jumping kilometers in seconds, then freezing, then showing us back where we started. It was like the forest was actively messing with space-time, or at least our perception and measurement of it. We had to stop and make camp before full darkness. We found a small, sheltered hollow, offering some minimal protection. Setting up the tents was a silent, grim affair. Hope was dwindling, replaced by a gnawing fear. We ate the last of our ready-to-eat meals, the food tasteless in our mouths. The silence returned as darkness gathered, but it was a loaded silence, pregnant with unseen things. Then the sounds began again. Not the clicks and growls of the previous night, but something new, something closer. A scraping sound like stone on stone, coming from just beyond the edge of our small camp. Then a low, guttural murmur, like voices whispering in a language we couldn't comprehend. It wasn't human. It was deep, resonant, coming from multiple sources just out of sight. Ben gripped his machete, his knuckles white. Evelyn huddled deeper into her sleeping bag, trembling. I lay in my tent, recorder on, listening to the sounds of our breathing, the frantic beating of our hearts, and the terrifying sounds from the darkness, the scraping, the murmuring. And now, a new sound, a faint, rhythmic thumping, like something large moving just outside the perimeter. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It felt like whatever was out there was assessing us, waiting. Sleep was completely impossible. Every sense was screaming danger. The air in the tent felt thick and heavy, the strange, earthy smell overpowering. The tent fabric seemed to absorb the minimal light from our headlamps, leaving us in oppressive gloom. The sounds continued, sometimes fading, sometimes seeming to press right up against the tent walls. The scraping sound was particularly unnerving, suggesting something moving with effort, something heavy and rough. The murmuring voices seemed to rise and fall, a disquieting chorus. The rhythmic thumping grew closer, then receded, a cruel game played by unseen entities. I found myself holding my breath, straining to identify the sounds, desperate for a rational explanation. But there was none. These were sounds that did not belong in a forest. They belonged to something else, something alien and terrifying. The Blackwood wasn't just a dangerous wilderness. It was a place inhabited by something unknown, something that had perhaps been responsible for the boot, for the disappearances, for the pervasive feeling of dread. We were trapped in its domain, and it was letting us know it. The night stretched on, an eternity of terror. Every moment felt like the prelude to an attack. We were exhausted, scared, and completely at the mercy of whatever lurked in the darkness. The silence was gone, replaced by a terrifying symphony of the unknown. We just had to endure until dawn, praying that the daylight would offer some respite, some clarity, or at least a chance to escape. The Blackwood had shown us its true nature, and it was far worse than any local legend. As the perpetual grey dawn of the Blackwood arrived on our fourth day, the sounds of the night faded, replaced by the heavy, expectant silence. We emerged from our tents utterly spent, physically and emotionally. Ben's usual composed demeanor had completely cracked. His eyes darted constantly and his hands shook as he tried to pack his gear. Evelyn was withdrawn, curled into herself, muttering about energy fields and dimensional folds, her scientific mind seemingly broken by the impossibility of the data she was collecting. My own state was precarious. The constant fear and lack of sleep were wearing me down, making it hard to think clearly. The air felt heavier than ever, the strange smell thick and nauseating. There were no obvious tracks around the camp perimeter, no physical evidence of the sounds and presences from the night. Yet the feeling of being surrounded, of being watched intently, was stronger than ever. It was a silent, suffocating pressure. We ate a few handfuls of dried fruit, our appetites gone. The water situation was critical. We had maybe a day's supply left between the three of us. Relying on finding a clean water source in this contaminated forest was a terrifying gamble. Our navigation issues persisted. Ben tried multiple times to get a fix on our position using both map and compass, but they seemed to contradict each other and previous readings. The GPS remained useless. We were lost, not just geographically, but in a place that seemed to actively defy mapping. We chose a direction, a gamble, a desperate hope that we might eventually stumble upon the edge. We moved slowly, painstakingly, the forest floor a treacherous mix of hidden holes, slick patches of strange moss, and roots that seemed to deliberately trip us. The trees pressed in, their branches forming a low, claustrophobic ceiling. The light, already dim, seemed to be actively retreating, plunging us into deeper gloom. We passed by more unsettling phenomena, patches of ground that felt intensely cold, sucking the heat from our bodies, areas where the air seemed to shimmer, distorting our vision, brief, localized fogs that appeared out of nowhere, thick and disorienting, smelling faintly of sulfur and something metallic. During one such fog, Ben became momentarily separated from us, just 20 feet away, but swallowed by the whiteout. We called out his name, our voices muffled by the fog. Panic clawed at me. When the fog dissipated seconds later, he was back in view, but his face was ashen. "Saw something," he whispered, his voice trembling. "In the fog. Just for a second. Like shapes moving. Too tall. Not animal." He wouldn't elaborate, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. He had seen something that had broken his composure completely. The incident cemented our fear. This forest wasn't just disorienting. It was populated by something unseen, something that used the environment to its advantage. Evelyn, despite her terror, continued her attempts at scientific analysis. She rigged up a small, portable electromagnetic field sensor on a walking stick. The readings were off the scale in certain areas, fluctuating wildly. "It's like a massive, erratic energy source," she stammered, her voice high-pitched. "But there's no geological marker for anything like this. No fault lines, no volcanic activity, no major mineral deposits that would generate these fields. And the pattern of the fluctuations, it's not random. It has a kind of rhythm to it, but not a natural one." Her scientific detachment was gone, replaced by a desperate need to understand, to categorize the impossible. We stumbled upon another clearing, this one larger but just as unnerving. In its center was a deep, dark pit, perhaps 50 feet across, its edges crumbling into the gray soil. A faint, low hum emanated from it, similar to the one near the strange tree, but deeper, more resonant. The air around the pit was intensely cold. Looking into the pit was like staring into an abyss. No light seemed to penetrate its depths. It felt like a void, a drain on the surrounding energy. Ben threw a small stone towards the edge. It rolled in and we waited, listening intently. No sound of it hitting the bottom. No splash of water. Just silence and the unsettling hum. It felt bottomless. "Another one," Ben said, his voice flat. "Energy source, energy sink. This whole place is wired up." He pointed towards the edges of the clearing. More of the pale-barked trees grew there, interspersed with patches of the sickly green glowing fungi we'd seen earlier. The pit felt like the nexus of the Blackwood's strange power, the source of the energy fluctuations, maybe even the origin of the infrasound. Evelyn approached the edge cautiously, her senses spiking. "The radiation is higher here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Significantly higher. And the atmospheric composition is showing traces of something that shouldn't exist in the upper atmosphere, let alone at ground level." It was too much. The boot, the sounds, the impossible navigation, the energy fields, the radiation, the bottomless pit. It was overwhelming. We had to get out. We backed away from the pit. The feeling of being watched now accompanied by a new sensation. A feeling of intense cold emanating from the void. It felt like the pit was actively looking at us. A vast, empty eye in the heart of the forest. We pushed on, leaving the clearing behind, the hum of the pit seeming to follow us, vibrating in our chests. Our pace was slower now, our bodies failing, our minds struggling under the weight of the relentless strangeness and fear. The forest seemed to close in further, the light almost entirely gone now, even though it was only late afternoon. We were moving through a world of perpetual twilight. Ben was struggling to keep his bearings, his face a mask of despair. "It's no use," he gasped, leaning against a twisted tree, his chest heaving. "I can't tell which way is which. North, south, east, west. It all feels the same. The land keeps folding in on itself." He looked utterly defeated. Evelyn was staring into the gloom, her eyes unfocused. "The energy readings. They're fluctuating with my heart rate," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. "It's affecting us. The forest. It's interacting with our biology." It sounded like the edge of madness, but after everything we had experienced, it felt horribly plausible. The forest was somehow manipulating not just the environment, but our very selves. We were trapped, exhausted, dehydrated, and losing our minds. We had to make camp, but the prospect of another night, filled with terrifying sounds and unseen presences, was almost unbearable. We found a small recess under an overhang of rock, offering minimal shelter. Huddled together, we shared the last of our water. It was warm and tasted faintly metallic. The darkness descended quickly, thick and absolute. The silence returned, heavy and expectant. Then the sounds began again. This time, they were closer. The scraping, the murmuring, the rhythmic thumping, right outside our small refuge. And a new sound, a wet, slithering sound, like something immense dragging itself over damp earth. Fear, cold and paralyzing, gripped us. We were cornered. Ben drew his machete, his breathing ragged. Evelyn whimpered, covering her ears. I fumbled for my recorder, my hand trembling so violently I could barely hold it. The sounds intensified, surrounding our small pocket of perceived safety. The murmuring grew louder, almost a chant, in that unknown, non-human language. The scraping and thumping were right at the edge of the overhang. The slithering sound circled us slowly. We could feel vibrations in the rock floor beneath us. Something large was moving out there, just inches away, separated by thin rock and dense undergrowth. The air grew colder, the strange smell overpowering. The feeling of being watched was no longer a pressure, but a physical sensation like icy fingers tracing our skin. We were trapped, exhausted, and facing the unknown entities of the Blackwood. There was nowhere left to run, and no hope of rescue. This was it, the night that would determine if we joined the ranks of the missing or if, by some impossible miracle, we survived. The sounds rose to a crescendo, a symphony of terror. We braced ourselves, huddled together in the oppressive darkness, waiting for whatever was out there to make its move. The Blackwood had finally cornered us. The sounds outside our rock shelter on the fourth night built to a terrifying peak, a cacophony of scraping, thumping, slithering, and that guttural, non-human murmuring. It felt like the very rock was vibrating with the intensity of whatever was out there. Then abruptly, silence fell again. Not the light, expectant silence of morning, but a heavy, waiting silence, thick with menace. We remained huddled together, frozen in fear, for what felt like hours. Eventually, exhaustion began to override the terror. Ben, still clutching his machete, his eyes wide and staring into the blackness, eventually slumped against the rock, breathing heavily. Evelyn lay curled up, her face buried in her arms, trembling. I gripped my recorder, its small red light a tiny beacon in the overwhelming darkness, capturing only our ragged breaths and the pounding of our hearts. Nothing breached the overhang. Whatever had surrounded us seemed to have simply stopped or moved away. Or maybe, most terrifyingly, was still out there, watching, waiting. We didn't sleep. We couldn't. Every creak of the rock, every rustle of leaves, sent jolts of fear through us. The feeling of being watched remained constant, a palpable pressure. As the Blackwood's dim dawn began to filter through the canopy, the silence remained absolute. We slowly, cautiously, emerged from the shelter. The area around the overhang was undisturbed. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign that anything had been there at all. It was like the terrifying events of the night had been a shared hallucination, except for the lingering terror in our eyes and the physical exhaustion that weighed us down. Ben looked utterly broken. I don't understand, he stammered, his voice hoarse. Never seen anything like it. Felt real. Felt like they were right there. Evelyn was staring at the ground, shaking her head. The sensors, the energy readings, spiked last night, she mumbled. Off the charts, coinciding with the peak of the sounds. It wasn't a hallucination. Something was here, something generating immense energy. The scientific data, once again, confirmed the horrifying subjective experience. We were not just going mad. The Blackwood was physically affecting our reality. We had almost no water and were completely lost. Staying put felt like waiting to die. Trying to move felt like a futile effort in a maze that defied logic. But we had to try. We started moving again. Direction chosen arbitrarily, simply moving away from the rock shelter and the memory of the terrifying night. The forest seemed even denser, the light dimmer. The air was thick with the strange smells, now including a faint scent of decay that hadn't been there before. We moved like automatons, one foot in front of the other, our bodies aching, our minds numb with fatigue and fear. The feeling of being watched was now a dull ache, constant but no longer sparking acute panic. We had moved beyond that into a state of resigned dread. We stumbled upon another anomaly, a cluster of trees that seemed fused together at the base, growing into a single, massive, multi-trunked entity. Their bark was slick and black, oozing a viscous, dark sap that smelled faintly sweet and metallic. As we passed, we heard a low, wet, pulsing sound coming from within the fused trunks. It sounded like a giant, slow heartbeat. Evelyn, despite her state, was drawn to it, reaching out a trembling hand to touch the black bark. "Energy, radiating from it," she whispered. "And thermal energy. It's warm to the touch, like the stones in the first clearing. But this is alive." She recoiled as a drop of the black sap oozed onto her glove. It seemed to sizzle faintly. We pulled her away, the pulsing sound and the sight of the oozing sap deeply unsettling. The forest wasn't just influencing us. It was itself manifesting strange, unnatural life forms, perhaps fueled by the unseen energy sources. We were moving through an ecosystem unlike any on Earth, hours blurred together. Walking, navigating impossible terrain, seeing fleeting movements in the periphery, hearing faint, unidentifiable sounds just at the edge of hearing. The thirst was becoming unbearable. Our mouths were dry, our lips cracked. Dehydration was setting in. Ben, normally the picture of resilience, stumbled frequently, his face pale and gaunt. Evelyn was quiet, her eyes distant, occasionally mumbling scientific terms that no longer seemed relevant. I kept the recorder running, hoping against hope that somehow, someday, this record would make it out, a testament to the impossible reality of the Blackwood. We were walking through a relatively open area, less dense than the rest of the forest, when we heard it. A new sound, a faint, distorted voice. Human. It seemed to be calling out, but the words were garbled, stretched and warped, like a signal struggling through immense interference. "Hello," I yelled back, my voice cracking. Silence. We waited, listening intently. The voice came again, clearer this time, though still distorted. It sounded like a man's voice, desperate. "Help us. Lost. Can't get out." Ben froze. "Another group?" he whispered, a flicker of hope in his eyes. Evelyn looked up, her gaze sharpening slightly. Could there be other people trapped in here? Maybe people who had been here longer? Maybe people who knew a way out? We followed the sound of the voice, crashing through the undergrowth, yelling out. The voice seemed to lead us on, always just ahead, sometimes clearer, sometimes fading. It felt like a lifeline. But as we followed, the forest seemed to subtly shift around us. The ground became uneven. The trees grew closer together. The light dimmed further. The feeling of being watched intensified, and the air grew colder. Ben stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. The voice had stopped. Silence returned, thick and immediate. We stood panting, listening. Nothing. No voice. No sign of anyone. Ben looked around, his face hardening. "It was a trick," he said, his voice grim. "It led us deeper in." He pointed behind us. The relatively open area we had just been in was gone, replaced by the same dense, oppressive woods we had been struggling through. The voice had been a lure, designed to pull us further into the maze, further from any potential edge. Despair washed over me. Even potential rescue was a tool used by the Blackwood to trap its victims. We were truly alone, and the forest was actively working against us. Physical and mental exhaustion, coupled with the crushing realization that we had been deliberately manipulated, broke something inside us. We collapsed onto the ground, too weary to even try to move. The thirst was agony. As darkness began its descent, the strange sounds returned, closer and more varied than ever. The scraping, the thumping, the slithering, the murmuring. And now, new sounds, high-pitched keening wails that sounded like distorted animal cries, and a low, grinding noise that felt like the earth itself was groaning. We huddled together, listening to the horrifying symphony surround us, the air vibrating with the unseen energy. Ben didn't reach for his machete this time. Evelyn didn't look at her senses. We just sat there waiting, our faces turned up to the dim canopy, the weight of the Blackwood pressing down on us, the terrifying sounds closing in. We were at our limit. The forest had broken our bodies and was working on our minds. Survival seemed impossible. The night promised only more terror and a likely end to our journey into America's forbidden forest. We had entered, and it seemed we might not return. The fifth night in the Blackwood was a blur of terror and delirium. Dehydration intensified the strangeness, blurring the lines between reality and hallucination. The sounds outside our makeshift camp were constant, no longer fading or returning, but a continuous, layered assault on our senses. The scraping, the thumping, the slithering, the guttural murmuring, the keening wails, the grinding earth groans. They were all present, swirling around us, occasionally punctuated by new, horrifying noises we couldn't begin to describe. I kept the recorder going, a desperate act of defiance. But the sounds captured on it were chaotic, distorted by static and interference that seemed to ebb and flow with the intensity of the surrounding noise. Listening back later, I knew it would sound like a recording from hell. Ben was unresponsive, curled into a fetal position, trembling. Evelyn was mumbling incoherently, pointing into the darkness, seeing things that weren't there. Or maybe were there, just invisible to me. My own mind felt like it was fracturing. I saw fleeting shapes in the darkness, felt phantom touches, heard whispers that seemed to come from inside my skull. The strange smells intensified, sickeningly sweet and metallic, making me gag. The cold radiating from the unseen energy sources was bone-chilling. We were beyond fear. We were in a state of numb endurance, waiting for something to happen, for the night to end, for consciousness to cease. Towards what felt like the middle of the night, the sounds outside reached another crescendo, louder than ever, closer. The ground vibrated violently beneath us. A high-pitched whine, like immense machinery, joined the chorus, piercing through the other noises. And then, a profound silence. Not the quiet cessation of the previous night, but an instantaneous, absolute, unnatural silence that felt like the world had been turned off. It was more terrifying than the noise. In that silence, felt more than heard was a presence. Close. Impossibly close. I could feel it, a vast, ancient awareness right outside our shelter, examining us. It wasn't malevolent in a human sense, it was alien, indifferent, powerful. It felt like being under a microscope, observed by something that didn't care about our fear, our pain, our desperation. This awareness lingered for what felt like an eternity, a crushing weight in the darkness. Then, Slowly, the fainter sounds began to return. The distant ones first, gradually building back up. The presence receded, leaving behind only the residue of terror and the knowledge that we had been inspected. As dawn finally broke, the familiar grey light pushing back the absolute darkness, we were barely functional. Ben could barely move. Evelyn was unresponsive, her eyes staring blankly. I managed to sit up, my body aching, my head pounding. The air was thick and still, the strange smells overwhelming. I checked our water supply again. Empty. Dehydration was now a critical threat. We had to move. Staying here meant certain death. I managed to rouse Ben, pulling him to his feet. He moved stiffly like an old man, leaning heavily on his walking stick. Evelyn remained unresponsive. I knelt beside her, shaking her gently. "Evelyn, we have to go. We need water." She didn't react. Her skin was cold. Her breathing was shallow. I checked her pulse. Weak and thready, the forest had taken its toll. She was succumbing, either physically or mentally, or perhaps both. We couldn't carry her. Ben was barely able to walk himself. Leaving her felt like an unimaginable betrayal. But the brutal reality of our situation left no other choice if there was any hope for us. I'll leave her some water," I stammered, though we had none. Maybe if we find water, we can come back for her." It was a lie, a desperate attempt to justify leaving her behind. Ben just stared blankly, unable to process. I placed her environmental sensor carefully beside her, a small, useless totem. "I'm sorry, Evelyn," I whispered, my voice choked with tears. "I'm so sorry." Turning away was the hardest thing I've ever done. Ben and I began to move, leaving Evelyn behind in the grey gloom of the Blackwood. Our progress was agonizingly slow. Every step was an effort. Thirst was consuming me. My mouth felt like sandpaper, my tongue swollen. Ben was stumbling more often now. We needed water desperately. As we walked, the forest seemed to change again. The trees seemed smaller, younger, less gnarled. The undergrowth was still dense, but different, less hostile. There were even faint signs of animal life. A bird call, far off, sounding weak and distorted. A rustle in the bushes that might have been a small animal. Was this the edge? Were we somehow miraculously heading in the right direction? Hope, a fragile, dangerous thing in the Blackwood, flickered. We pushed on, driven by the desperate need for water and the faint possibility of escape. We stumbled upon a small stream. The water looked clear, flowing over smooth stones. It felt like salvation. But the memory of the contaminated stream on day 2 and the Blackwood's tricks made me hesitate. Ben, however, was beyond caution. He fell to his knees at the bank, cupping his hands to drink. "No, Ben, wait!" I yelled, but it was too late. He drank greedily, splashing water on his face. I pulled out my limited water testing kit, the basic one I carried as backup. The readings were ambiguous, showing some trace contaminants, but nothing as high as the previous stream. It seemed mostly clean. Or clean. Enough. My thirst was overwhelming. I knelt beside Ben, scooped water into my hands and drank. It tasted cool, earthy, and faintly sweet. After the first gulp, I couldn't stop, drinking deeply, letting the water soothe my parched throat. Ben sighed, sitting back on the bank. "God," he whispered. Never thought I'd taste anything so good. The water seemed to replenish us, giving us a small surge of energy. We filled our water bottles, adding purification tablets just in case, though my skepticism was high. We ate some more dried fruit, the water helping it go down. With renewed, fragile hope, we continued our push, following the direction the stream seemed to flow. The environment did seem less overtly hostile here. The silence wasn't as absolute. There were faint, distant sounds that might have been natural. The light seemed slightly brighter. The trees, while still dense, weren't as aggressively tangled. Maybe, just maybe, we were making it out. Then the feeling of being watched intensified again. Not the constant pressure, but a focused, specific gaze. Ben suddenly stopped. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I strained my ears. Nothing. What? Sounded like footsteps, he said, his eyes scanning the woods around us. Following us. We stood still, listening. Silence. Then a faint snap of a twig from behind us. It was distant, but distinct. Someone or something was following us. The fragile hope evaporated, replaced by a cold dread. The Blackwood wasn't letting us go easily. We moved faster now, urgency propelling our tired bodies. But the snapping twig followed, always just behind us, always just out of sight. It wasn't a large animal. The sound was too deliberate, too paced. It felt like someone was tracking us, slowly, patiently. We didn't dare look back. We just kept moving. The sound of the footsteps behind us, a chilling reminder that we were still very much in the Blackwood's domain, and it hadn't finished with us yet. The fear returned, sharp and cold, cutting through the exhaustion. We were escaping one kind of horror, only to be pursued by another. The sounds from the night, the lost voice, the boot, the pit, the strange tree, the terrifying presence, leaving Evelyn behind. It all culminated in this desperate, terrifying flight. The unseen pursuer just behind us, matching our pace, a silent, relentless predator in America's forbidden forest. The footsteps behind us continued, a steady, unnerving rhythm that matched our own frantic pace. It wasn't a casual stroll. It was a deliberate pursuit. We didn't call out, didn't look back. We just pushed forward, the need to escape overriding the fear of the unknown following us. Ben kept glancing over his shoulder, his face etched with terror. His earlier breakdown seemed to have been replaced by a desperate, animalistic drive to survive. The environment, though seemingly less hostile than the deeper parts of the Blackwood, still felt wrong. The light was still dim, the air thick, the silence occasionally broken by the following footsteps or brief, unsettling whispers that seemed to skitter through the trees around us. Were they the same voices from the night, now tracking us? We came to a steep incline, the ground covered in loose scree. It was slow going, our tired legs struggling to find purchase. The footsteps behind us didn't falter. They seemed to glide over the difficult terrain as easily as on level ground, perhaps even gaining on us. As we neared the top of the rise, I risked a quick glance back. Nothing was visible through the dense trees, but I felt them there, just behind the veil of foliage, watching us struggle. The sensation was like being hunted by ghosts, unseen, but undeniably present. We crested the rise and saw a narrow ravine ahead, choked with dense, dark bushes. There was no way around it without adding significant time to our journey. Ben hesitated for a split second, glancing at the pursuit behind us. "Through it!" he gasped, urgency in his voice. We plunged into the ravine. The bushes were thick, thorny, tearing at our clothes and skin. The light was almost non-existent in the narrow cut. We scrambled through, blind and desperate, the sounds of our passage loud in the confined space. Behind us, the distinct snap of twigs, the rustle of leaves. The pursuer was entering the ravine. We emerged on the other side, scratched and bleeding, but with a small lead. The terrain here was flatter, still densely wooded, but perhaps offering a chance to move faster. We ran, stumbling through the trees, the sound of our footsteps loud in the oppressive silence. But the footsteps behind us were just as loud, just as close. They weren't losing ground. It was then I realized something horrifying. The footsteps behind us. There was no change in pace or sound regardless of the terrain. Whether we were on soft leaves, loose scree, or pushing through thick bushes, the footsteps sounded the same. Steady, rhythmic, deliberate. It was impossible for a human, or even most animals, to move like that. Whatever was following us wasn't bound by the same physical limitations. It was like the forest itself was walking. Panic surged, making my lungs burn. We were being hunted by the Blackwood. We ran until our lungs felt like they would burst, until our legs screamed in protest. We stumbled into another small clearing, similar to the others, circular, grey soil, devoid of trees. In the center was a large, dark rock, pulsating faintly with that same unsettling hum as the strange tree. The air around it was intensely cold. As we stopped to catch our breath, leaning against trees at the edge of the clearing, the footsteps behind us stopped too. Silence returned, thick and immediate, broken only by our ragged breathing and the faint pulse of the rock. We scanned the tree line around the clearing, expecting to see something emerge. Nothing. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, coming from all directions, and strongest from the rock in the center. It felt like the rock was an eye, observing us. Or maybe it was broadcasting the awareness of our pursuers. Ben, despite his terror, noticed something else. "Look," he panted, pointing to the ground at the edge of the clearing where the grey soil met the forest floor. Faint indentations. Not footprints. Not exactly. More like shallow depressions, elongated, leading into the clearing, and none leading out on our side. We followed the line of depressions with our eyes, tracing them across the clearing towards the rock. They seemed to converge on it, and then we saw more depressions, leading away from the rock, deeper into the forest, in a direction different from the one we had been taking. It was like the rock was a waypoint, or maybe a nexus. The entities following us seemed to originate from these clearings, these points of strange energy. The rock pulsed stronger now, the hum intensifying. The cold radiated from it, chilling us to the bone. The air around it seemed to shimmer. The footsteps behind us were silent, but the presence was immense, surrounding the clearing. We were trapped between the unseen pursuers and the pulsating rock. Ben, with a sudden surge of adrenaline, grabbed my arm. "Not staying here," he rasped. He looked at the trail of depressions leading away from the rock, deeper into the woods. It was the direction the voice had tried to lure us towards yesterday, but it was also a path that seemed to be used by whatever was in the Blackwood. It was a terrifying choice. Face the unknown entities lurking in the trees, or follow their path deeper into the heart of the forest. The thought of the entities, silent and unstoppable, waiting just beyond the tree line, was unbearable. "The path!" I choked out, my voice trembling. Ben nodded grimly. We moved quickly across the grey soil, skirting the pulsating rock, heading towards the depressions leading into the forest. As we reached the tree line and stepped onto the path, the footsteps behind us resumed, entering the clearing. We didn't look back. We followed the path, which wasn't really a path, just a series of these strange depressions leading through the dense woods. The trees here were different again, taller, straighter, but their bark was mottled and grey, and their leaves seemed to absorb the light entirely. The air was thick and humid. The feeling of being watched was constant, but seemed to come from ahead of us now, as well as behind. It was like we were moving into a trap, or perhaps a gathering place. The strange sounds returned, muffled by the dense foliage, but surrounding us. The clicks, the murmuring, the distant groans. The path twisted and turned, leading us deeper and deeper into this unnerving part of the Blackwood. We passed more anomalies, small stagnant pools that glowed faintly with an internal light, patches of ground that felt strangely soft and yielding underfoot, as if walking on something alive. The silence was gone, replaced by the constant symphony of unsettling sounds and the relentless, silent footsteps behind us. We were moving deeper into the heart of the Blackwood, following the trail of the entities, knowing that every step took us further from the world we knew, and closer to whatever terrifying secret lay hidden within this forbidden forest. Escape felt increasingly impossible. Survival felt like a distant dream. We were simply moving forward into the unknown, pursued by the impossible, in a place that seemed determined not to let us leave. The path of strange depressions led us through the grey-barked forest, the air thick and humid, the light minimal. The sounds of the Blackwood pulsed around us, closer and more distinct now. The low murmuring, the rhythmic clicking, the high-pitched keening, and that unsettling grinding noise. The silent footsteps followed relentlessly, always just behind us, a constant reminder of the pursuit. We moved in a state of exhausted dread, our bodies aching, our minds numb. The dehydration was a dull throb, occasionally spiking into agonizing thirst. Our reserves were gone. We needed water, or shelter, or some sign that this path led somewhere other than oblivion. The grey-barked trees grew denser, their branches interlocking overhead to form a near-complete canopy that plunged us into deeper gloom. The ground became soft and spongy underfoot, yielding slightly with each step, as if we were walking on compressed moss or some unnatural, springy vegetation. The strange smells intensified, a mix of the heavy earth, the metallic tang, and a new, musty odor that felt ancient and oppressive. We passed more glowing pools, their light casting an eerie, sickly green glow upwards through the trees. The humming sound from the pulsating rocks seemed ever present now, a low thrum that vibrated through our bones. It felt like we were moving through the nervous system of the Blackwood, following pathways created or used by its unseen inhabitants. The feeling of being watched was no longer just an uncomfortable sensation. It felt like actual pressure on our skin, like countless invisible eyes were focused on us, dissecting our every move. Ben stumbled and fell, collapsing onto the soft, spongy ground. I knelt beside him, adrenaline giving me a brief burst of strength. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. "Can't," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Can't go on." He was done, broken, dehydrated, exhausted. terrified. I knew I couldn't leave another person behind, but I also knew staying put meant certain capture by whatever was following us. The footsteps stopped nearby. Silence. The air grew intensely cold. I looked around wildly, expecting to see them emerge. Nothing. But the presence was overwhelming, just beyond the screen of grey-barked trees. It felt like they were standing there watching us, waiting for us to be completely incapacitated. My eyes fell on a patch of the glowing fungi near Ben's head. Its light pulsed faintly. An idea, desperate and maybe insane, formed in my mind. The fungi, the pulsing rocks, the fused trees. They all seemed connected to the strange energy of the Blackwood. Maybe they were part of it. Maybe they were a way to interact with it. Ben, I said, my voice trembling. Ben, the fungi, the rocks, they pulse. Their energy, maybe we can use them. He stared at me blankly, uncomprehending. It was a long shot, a shot born of desperation and delirium. But what other choice did we have? I looked at the footsteps trail leading away from us on the path, deeper into the gloom. I looked at Ben, collapsing on the spongy ground. I looked at the trees surrounding us, hiding the unseen things that pursued us. My gaze returned to the glowing fungi. I reached out a trembling hand and touched the closest patch. It felt cool and slightly firm, like a strange, cold flesh. As my fingers made contact, the glow intensified slightly. A faint hum emanated from the fungi, mirroring the hum from the distant rocks. It felt like a connection, a resonance. I took a deep breath and pressed my hand more firmly onto the glowing surface. The hum intensified, vibrating up my arm. The air around me grew colder. The strange smells became overwhelming. My vision swam, and then images flooded my mind. Not sights, but impressions, shapes, patterns, movement. The forest floor beneath me seemed to shift and flow. The trees around me pulsed with unseen energy. And I saw them, the entities, not visually but as forms in my mind's eye. Tall, thin shapes, moving with that impossible gliding motion through the trees. They weren't solid in a conventional sense. They seemed to flicker, to warp the space around them. They were ancient, connected to the very fabric of the Blackwood. They were the source of the sounds, the energy fields, the disorientation. They weren't animals, not spirits, not cryptids. They were something else. Something that belonged to this place, that was perhaps part of this place. And they saw us as intruders. The images were overwhelming, terrifying. I pulled my hand away from the fungi, gasping for air. The visions vanished, leaving behind a searing headache and a profound sense of dread. The footsteps behind us resumed, closer now, entering the grey-barked forest. They knew. Touching the fungi, making that connection had revealed our presence, our attempt to understand. "They're coming," I croaked, my voice barely a whisper. Ben stirred slightly, groaning. I had to get him up. I had to keep moving. But where? Deeper into the Blackwood, into the heart of their domain? Or try to break away, crashing blindly through the oppressive forest, hoping to find an edge that seemed to vanish the closer we got? The path of depressions continued ahead, leading into an even darker, denser part of the woods. It was the way the entities moved. Maybe following their path was the only way to navigate this place. Or maybe it was leading us directly into their trap. The sounds of the entities were closer now, surrounding us. The murmuring was louder, clearer, a complex, resonant chorus that vibrated in my chest. The grinding noise intensified. The footsteps were just behind the tree line, right beside the path. They were waiting for us to step forward, or perhaps waiting for us to collapse. Ben pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, shaking his head. What was that? He mumbled. Saw things. He had felt the connection too, through the fungi, or maybe just through proximity. He had seen the entities in his mind. The shared experience, brief and terrifying, cemented the reality of what we were facing. It wasn't just a forest. It was something else entirely, something ancient and powerful, and we were caught within it. The entities were closing in. We could feel their presence pressing in from all sides. The path ahead beckoned, dark and uncertain, leading into the heart of the Blackwood. The alternative was to be surrounded and overwhelmed here. There was no real choice. The path, Ben, I said, helping him to his feet. We follow the path. With the last of our strength, we stepped onto the trail of depressions, moving forward into the deepest, darkest part of America's forbidden forest. The sounds of the entities surrounding us, the silent footsteps falling into step behind us, the terrifying unknown stretching out before us. We had entered the Blackwood, and now we were walking directly into the maw of whatever inhabited it, hoping against hope that there was an end to the path, and that end didn't lead to a fate worse than being lost. The path of depressions led us into a part of the Blackwood that felt fundamentally different from anywhere else we had been. The grey-barked trees gave way to trees that seemed made of shadow and silence, their bark a lightless black, their branches absorbing every hint of light. The spongy ground became slick and cold underfoot. The air was heavy, still, and intensely cold, carrying the strongest concentration of the strange, metallic, earthy smell. The sounds of the entities were here too, but different, less varied, more consistent. A low, resonant hum interspersed with soft, rustling whispers that seemed to weave through the air like invisible threads. The silent footsteps followed, always just behind us, a constant reminder that we were being escorted, not escaping. We moved slowly, Ben leaning heavily on me, our progress agonizingly slow. Our bodies screamed in protest with every step. Thirst was a burning fire in our throats. My mind felt detached from my body, observing the grim reality unfolding around us with a detached clarity that was perhaps its own form of breakdown. The path of depressions led through what felt like a vast, open space, despite the density of the trees. It was hard to judge distance here. The blackness seemed to swallow perspective. We passed by more anomalies, standing stones that pulsed with faint light and emanated intense cold, pools of liquid that shimmered and changed color, plants that seemed to writhe with slow internal movement. Evelyn's sensors, which I still carried along with mine and Ben's gear, were useless here, their screens flickering erratically, displaying nonsensical readings. The energy levels were off the scale, disrupting all our technology. This was the heart of the Blackwood, the source of its strangeness, the domain of the entities. As we moved deeper, the low hum intensified, vibrating not just in my chest but throughout my entire body. It felt like a frequency, a signal. The rustling whispers seemed to coalesce, forming patterns, almost like language but utterly alien, devoid of meaning I could comprehend. We reached a point where the path widened into a large clearing. This clearing was different from the others. It was vast, the sky above, visible as a dark, starless expanse through a break in the dense canopy. The ground was the same grey soil, but smoother, almost polished. And in the center of the clearing, arranged in a precise geometric pattern that made no sense to human eyes, were dozens of the pulsating rocks and several of the fused, black-barked trees. They hummed in unison, a deep, powerful resonance that filled the clearing. The air here was colder than anywhere else, biting and sharp. The feeling of the entity's presence was overwhelming. They were everywhere in the clearing, unseen but palpable, surrounding the geometric arrangement of rocks and trees. This was their place, their gathering, their mechanism. It felt like a vast, ancient machine powered by the energy of the Blackwood, built by the entities for purposes unknown. It was terrifying and awe-inspiring, a glimpse into a reality that defied human understanding. The silent footsteps behind us stopped as we entered the clearing. Ben and I stood at the edge, staring at the scene before us, too exhausted and terrified to move. The humming intensified, building to a peak. The pulsating rocks glowed brighter. The fused trees seemed to throb with dark life. And then, from the spaces between the rocks and trees, from the edges of the clearing, the entities emerged. They weren't fully visible, not in a way our eyes could process. They were distortions in the air, shimmering heat hazes in the intense cold, vertical lines of visual static that seemed to shift and flow. They were tall, impossibly thin, their forms fluid and unnatural. There were many of them, filling the clearing, surrounding the geometric arrangement, turning their collective, unseen gaze upon us. They didn't speak with voices, but with that resonant hum, that chorus of whispers that resonated directly in my mind, bypassing my ears. It wasn't language in a human sense, but a communication of concepts, of purpose. And the message was clear. We were intruders. We did not belong. This place was not for us. There was no aggression, no malice as humans understand it, just a profound, absolute assertion of their domain and our trespass. They didn't move towards us. They simply existed in the clearing, their presence a crushing weight, their forms shimmering in the cold air. It felt like we were expected, like the path had led us here deliberately. Was this where the lost went? Were they absorbed into this ancient mechanism? Were they somehow transformed, becoming part of the Blackwood? The thought was terrifying. Ben whimpered beside me, collapsing back onto the soft ground, burying his face in his arms. He couldn't handle it. I stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at the shimmering forms of the entities, listening to their resonant hum fill the air and my mind. This was the secret of the Blackwood. Not a monster, not a curse, but something ancient, alien, and powerful, existing alongside our reality, manipulating the environment, drawing energy from sources we couldn't fathom, and occasionally, perhaps inadvertently, interacting with the human world when its inhabitants stumbled into its domain. The disappearances, the strange phenomena, the feeling of being watched, it all stemmed from these entities and their connection to this place, this vast, living mechanism within the forest. I fumbled for my recorder, holding it up towards the clearing, a futile gesture of documentation against the impossible. The screen was blank, the device dead. My camera, my phone, everything was dead. The Blackwood, the entities, were immune to our technology, perhaps even actively hostile to it. We had nothing left but our failing bodies and our shattered minds. The entities held us in their collective gaze. The humming intensified again. It wasn't just a sound. It felt like energy flowing through me, through Ben, through the clearing, connecting everything. I felt dizzy, disoriented, my grip on reality slipping further. Was this it? Was this how the Blackwood claimed its victims? By overwhelming them with its energy, its presence, dissolving them into the fabric of the place. A faint image flashed in my mind. Evelyn, back where we left her, perhaps also succumbing to the forest's influence. Was she here now? Somehow part of this vast, humming consciousness? The thought was both horrifying and strangely comforting. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for whatever was next. The cold air burning my lungs, the hum vibrating through my entire being, the presence of the entities surrounding me. We had entered America's forbidden forest, sought its secrets, and now we were at its heart, about to become another part of its terrifying, inexplicable mystery. There was no more running, no more hiding, no more hoping. There was only the overwhelming presence of the Blackwood and its inhabitants, and the certainty that we would not be leaving. The humming of the entities and their geometric arrangement in the vast clearing intensified, building to a frequency that felt like it was going to tear me apart from the inside. The cold radiated from the pulsating rocks, an icy grip that seemed to bypass my skin and freeze my very bones. The shimmering forms of the entities moved slowly, gracefully within the clearing, their impossible shapes weaving between the humming stones and throbbing trees. They weren't just watching us anymore, they were actively interacting with the space, with the energy. I felt a pull, a subtle force drawing me forward, towards the center of the clearing, towards the humming heart of the Blackwood. It wasn't a physical drag, but a resonant frequency that seemed to resonate with something deep within me, a part of my consciousness that was responding to their alien signal. Ben remained collapsed beside me, his body trembling, his mind likely lost in the terror or the delirium. I was alone in facing this. The whispers surrounding the hum grew louder, more complex. They still weren't language, but they conveyed information, concepts that flowed directly into my awareness. Ideas of immense age, of deep connection to the earth, of cycles of energy and transformation. They felt like the thoughts of something ancient and fundamental. The pit we had seen, the strange tree, the glowing fungi, the pulsating rocks, the clearings, the non-Euclidean geometry of the forest itself. They were all parts of a single, interconnected system. A vast, living mechanism powered by an energy source beyond human comprehension. Perhaps tapping into geological forces, atmospheric conditions, or even something more fundamental. And the entities were the operators, the conscious nodes within this system. They weren't malevolent or evil or good. They simply were bound to this place, existing on a different plane of reality that sometimes overlapped with ours. When humans stumbled into this overlap, the Blackwood reacted, disorienting, isolating, breaking down physical and mental barriers until the intruders became susceptible to assimilation, to becoming part of the system. The faint radiation Evelyn had detected, the strange atmospheric compounds, the intense energy fields. They were not pollution or technological remnants, but the byproduct of this ancient, natural to them, process. The voice we heard was likely a fragment of a previously absorbed consciousness, trapped in the energy flow, repeating a desperate plea that no longer had meaning to the entities. The boot, the disappearances, victims who had succumbed, their physical forms perhaps dissolved, their consciousness added to the collective awareness of the Blackwood. The terror was still present, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was overlaid with a strange sense of inevitability, almost understanding. This was the true nature of America's forbidden forest. Not a place of monsters, but a place inhabited by a consciousness so alien, so vast, that our presence was merely a perturbation, an anomaly to be smoothed out, integrated. The pull towards the center of the clearing grew stronger. I felt my feet begin to move, taking slow, unsteady steps onto the polished gray soil. The forms of the entities shimmered around me, their silent gaze fixed on my progression. The humming filled my head, my body, drowning out all other thoughts, all other sensations. Ben was a collapsed heap at the edge of the clearing, fading from my awareness. The world outside the Blackwood, my life, my identity, they were all receding, becoming distant, irrelevant. I was walking into the heart of the mystery, into the source of the power, into the waiting consciousness of the Blackwood. There was no fighting it. It wasn't a battle. It was a merging. As I walked further into the clearing, the individual forms of the entities seemed to blur, dissolving into the shimmering air, becoming one with the light, the hum, the cold, the polished ground, the pulsating rocks, the throbbing trees. I was walking into the mechanism itself. The sense of my own physical body began to fade, replaced by a feeling of expansion, of my awareness spreading, connecting to the vast network of energy and consciousness that permeated the clearing, the entire Blackwood. The sounds became clearer, no longer just hums and whispers, but complex patterns of vibration and frequency that conveyed information, history, purpose. I was seeing, hearing, feeling the Blackwood from the inside. It was ancient, vast, indifferent to human scale or time. It existed in cycles we couldn't comprehend, feeding on energy, processing information, maintaining its own unique equilibrium. Our intrusion was a disruption, a minor imbalance that needed to be corrected, and the correction was assimilation. My steps faltered. A last vestige of self, of individual identity, recoiled from the overwhelming integration. The terror flared one last time, sharp and pure. But it was too late. I was already too deep. The entity's presence wrapped around me not with force, but with an overwhelming resonance that dissolved the boundaries of my being. My physical form felt less real, less solid. My thoughts, my memories, my very sense of self began to fragment, to scatter like leaves in the wind, ready to be incorporated into the vast, murmuring consciousness of the Blackwood. This was the end of the journey, the final destination of those who entered America's forbidden forest and did not return. Not death, not disappearance in the conventional sense, but a terrifying, profound absorption. My last conscious thought was of the world outside, the world that would never know the true secret of the Blackwood, the world that would simply add our names to the list of the missing. The humming reached its peak, the light and cold, overwhelming. And then, nothing but the resonant frequency, the swirling patterns of energy and consciousness, and the understanding that I was no longer Alex, the journalist, but a new, infinitesimally small part of the ancient, forbidden forest. I had entered, and I did not return.
Привет, друзья.
The Blackwood claimed its own, adding another layer to its complex, terrifying reality, waiting patiently for the next curious soul, brave or foolish enough to cross its invisible boundary. It was here, hidden in plain sight, a testament to the unknown, a place where reality frayed and the ancient held sway. The air outside the Blackwood felt thin and loud after the oppressive atmosphere within. Sunlight, harsh and blinding after days of perpetual gloom, assaulted my eyes. I stumbled out of the tree line, collapsing onto the familiar hard-packed dirt of the long-abandoned logging road, the painted entry-forbidden signs blurring in my vision. My body felt like it was made of lead. Every muscle screaming in protest. My mouth was dry, my throat raw. I was alone. There was no sign of Ben, no sign of Evelyn.
Всегда ли то, что мы считаем вымыслом, на самом деле является лишь хорошо спрятанной правдой?
Having emerged from the heart of the Blackwood. How I got out, I didn't know. The last thing I remembered was standing in that vast clearing, surrounded by the shimmering entities, the humming filling my mind, the feeling of my identity dissolving. There were no memories of walking back, of navigating the impossible terrain, of passing the endless trees and strange anomalies. It was like I had blinked, and suddenly I was outside. But I wasn't the same. The Blackwood had marked me. Physically, I was gaunt, scratched, dehydrated, covered in dirt and sap. Mentally, I was a wreck. The silence of the outside world was jarring after the constant sounds of the forest. Yet a faint hum seemed to resonate within my own skull, a ghost echo of the entity's presence. The feeling of being watched was gone, replaced by a profound, unsettling emptiness, as if a part of me had been left behind in that humming clearing. I fumbled for my satellite phone, praying it still worked. Miraculously, it powered on, the signal bars appearing faintly. I managed to dial emergency services, my voice a hoarse whisper. Lost. In the Blackwood area. Need help. The call was patchy, cutting in and out, but I managed to convey my approximate location before the battery died. Then I waited. Hours crawled by. I huddled on the road, shivering despite the weak sunlight. The images and sensations from the Blackwood replaying in my mind. The pulsating rocks, the strange trees, the bottomless pit. The terrifying sounds, the shimmering forms of the entities. Evelyn's unresponsive face. Ben collapsing. It felt like a nightmare, but the scratches on my skin, the ache in my bones, and the phantom hum in my head were brutally real. Finally, I heard the distant sound of a helicopter. It grew louder, then a search and rescue team found me. Their faces were a mixture of relief and concern. They helped me into the helicopter, asking questions I struggled to answer coherently. How long was I in there? Who was with me? What happened? I tried to explain about Ben and Evelyn, about the strange phenomena, about getting lost. But the words felt inadequate, hollow. I couldn't tell them about the entities, the energy, the feeling of assimilation. It sounded like madness. I knew they wouldn't believe me. At the nearest hospital, I was treated for severe dehydration, exhaustion, and exposure. The doctors attributed my mental state to trauma and delirium. They searched for Ben and Evelyn, launching a more extensive operation but found no trace, just like the others, added to the list of the missing in the Blackwood. When I was stable enough, investigators questioned me. I told them the official story. We got lost, encountered hazardous terrain, ran out of water, my companions succumbed to the elements or accidents. I left out the impossible parts. The look in their eyes told me they were skeptical even of that, accustomed to the vague, often contradictory accounts of the few who made it out. My equipment was recovered from where I had dropped my pack near the road. My digital recorder. The memory card was corrupted, the audio files unusable. Static, distortion, brief bursts of unintelligible noise. The Blackwood had erased its own record. Evelyn's environmental sensors and samples were never found. Proof erased. I was released from the hospital, physically recovered, but inwardly shattered. The world outside felt wrong. Too bright, too loud, too normal. How could people go about their lives, unaware that places like the Blackwood existed? Unaware that ancient, alien entities shared the planet with us, hidden in plain sight? I tried to write about it, to document my experience, but the words wouldn't come. How do you describe shimmering forms that aren't physical? Sounds that enter your mind? A place that defies geography and time? A consciousness that absorbs identity? It sounded like a work of fiction, a fever dream. I looked at maps of the area tracing the boundary of the Blackwood. It was just a patch of green on a topographical survey, labeled restricted. No hint of the impossible reality contained within. The local legends persisted, dismissed by most as folklore or exaggerated tales of wilderness dangers. But I knew the truth. I had seen it, felt it, almost become part of it. The Blackwood was real. Its warnings were not about simple hazards, but about the fundamental nature of reality, about stepping into a place that existed outside the norms of human experience. I was one of the few who entered America's forbidden forest and returned, but a part of me was still there, vibrating with the humming, connected to the vast, ancient consciousness. I carried the Blackwood within me, a constant, terrifying secret. I knew I could never go back, not physically, but the forest, the entities, the mystery. They were now irrevocably a part of me. The silence of the nights is no longer just silence. It's filled with the phantom hum, the ghost whispers, the memory of being watched by something utterly alien. I survived, but I didn't escape. The Blackwood keeps its secrets,